She grabbed the microphone right out of the MC's hand live on camera in front of 500 people and pointed straight at the man mopping the floor. "Can someone please remove the help from my party?" The room went dead silent. The janitor didn't flinch. He didn't run. He just looked up steady as stone and said 7 words that broke the internet by morning. Nobody in that ballroom knew his name yet. But in 6 months, he would own everything she had. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. The invitation said, Business Elite Summit Gala Black Tie Required. Jack Carter read it off the laminated badge clipped to his chest. Not his invitation, his assignment. He was there to make sure the marble floors of the Whitmore Grand Hotel stayed clean enough to eat off of a requirement apparently for people who charged $3,000 a plate to eat rubber chicken and call it networking. He pushed his mop bucket through the service entrance at 6:47 p.m., nodded to the security guard who barely looked up from his phone, and got to work. Jack was 44 years old, 6 feet even, with the kind of quiet face that people forgot the moment he left the room. That had always suited him just fine. He had thick hands, the kind built from years of real labor, and dark eyes that had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by most of it. He wore the uniform like it was just clothes. Because to him it was. He'd been on the night shift at Whitmore Grand for 8 months. Before that, 3 years at a commercial cleaning company. Before that, a decade running his own small accounting firm out of a strip mall in Columbus, Ohio. Until his wife Sarah got sick. The medical bills came, and the firm went under, trying to keep up with both. He didn't talk about that. Not at work. Not really anywhere. What he talked about was his daughter Ella, who was 11 years old, and currently home with his neighbor, Mrs. Flores, probably watching something she wasn't supposed to, and eating cereal for dinner. He talked about the Reds. He talked about whether the vending machine on the 3rd floor was ever going to get fixed. That was Jack Carter. Quiet, steady, invisible by design. Gunt. The gala was in full swing by the time he wheeled his bucket into the east wing of the ballroom. The chandeliers were throwing gold light across everything. Women in gowns that cost more than his car moved between clusters of men in suits that fit like they were stitched directly onto their bodies. Someone was playing a grand piano near the back. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of things Jack couldn't name. He stayed near the edges, always near the edges. He'd learned early on that the best way to be invisible in a room full of important people was to keep moving. Stop and stand still. Someone asks you for something. Keep moving. Keep your eyes down and your furniture. He was working a spill near the East Bar. Someone had knocked over a glass of red wine and just walked away from it, like the floor would handle itself when he heard the voice. It wasn't loud exactly. It was the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud because it had never been told it couldn't fill a room. Crisp, certain. The voice of someone who had been the most important person in every room they'd ever entered. Is that seriously a mop bucket in my event space? Jack looked up. She was standing about 15 feet away in a dress the color of midnight, with her arms crossed, and her chin tilted up at an angle that said she had rehearsed this her entire life. Aria Vale, CEO of Vale Corporation. He recognized her from the portrait hanging in the hotel lobby, the one the concierge had pointed out when he asked who the event was for. Aria Vale, youngest female CEO in the Fortune 500, daughter of Edmund Vale. The future of American business. She was looking at him the way people look at a pothole, an inconvenience, an eyesore, something that shouldn't be there. There was a spill, ma'am, Jack said. I'm almost done. A spill. She said the word like it was his fault, like he had personally commissioned the spill just to ruin her evening. This is a $3 million event, and you're pushing a mop bucket through my guests. I'll be out of your way in a minute. You should have been out of my way before the doors opened. She turned to the man standing at her shoulder, her assistant, a young guy with a tablet and the look of someone who had stopped sleeping weeks ago. Devon, who is responsible for staffing tonight? The hotel's event coordinator, Ms. Vale. I can... Then get them, now. And get this. She gestured at Jack like he was the spill, not the man cleaning it out of my event. Jack wrung out the mop. Slow. Even. He had been spoken to this way before. Not often, but enough. There was a particular kind of person who looked at a uniform and saw a verdict rather than a job. Who looked at a mop and saw a life sentence. He had learned long ago that reacting was a trap. That the dignity you protected in silence was worth more than the satisfaction of whatever you wanted to say. But tonight was different. Tonight there were cameras. He'd noticed them when he came in a small documentary crew in the corner. 3 people with professional rigs. The kind of setup you saw at TED Talks and business conferences. Something about the Leaders of Tomorrow, a series one of the hotel's managers had mentioned. They were filming the whole event. And right now, one of those cameras was pointed directly at this exchange. Jack looked at it, just for a second. Then he looked back at Aria Vale. She was still talking. I want a formal complaint filed with hotel management. This is completely unacceptable. My guests should not have to navigate around the cleaning staff during Ms. Vale. She stopped. It wasn't that he was rude. He wasn't. His voice was level, even almost gentle. But there was something in it, a stillness like a wall that made her stop mid-sentence. I understand your frustration, he said, and I'll be out of here in 30 seconds. But that spill was a slip hazard for your guests. If someone had gone down on that floor tonight, he paused, that would have been a much bigger problem for your event than my bucket. The room around them had gone quiet. Not the whole ballroom, it was too big for that, but the cluster of people nearest to them had stopped their conversations. They were watching. Aria's eyes narrowed. Is that supposed to be clever? No, ma'am. Just accurate. Someone nearby laughed short and sharp, quickly smothered. Aria's jaw tightened. Do you know who I am? Yes, ma'am. Aria Vale, CEO of Vale Corporation. Then you understand that I can have you removed from this building and make sure you never work a hotel event in this city again. Jack nodded slowly. I understand that. Good. I hope, he said, and his voice was perfectly calm, that your vision is spotless. The silence that followed was the kind you could feel on your skin. He picked up his bucket, turned, and walked toward the service door. Behind him, he heard the murmur of the crowd restart, different now, charged with something electric, something half amused and half stunned. He didn't look back. What he didn't know, what he wouldn't find out until 3 days later when his neighbor's teenage son showed him a phone video with 200,000 views, was that the camera had caught every word. You're just a janitor. Then I hope your vision is spotless. The clip was 6 seconds long. It had been looped into a 20-second video with a caption that read, POV, the CEO who forgot that janitors have ears. By the time he found out, it had 4 million views and a comment section that was equal parts cheering and cringing. Some people thought he was a hero. Some thought he was about to be unemployed. They were both right. Son. Jack was called into the hotel manager's office the next morning. Gerald Fitch was a small man with a face shaped permanently into an expression of mild apology. He had the kind of job that required him to keep people like Aria Vale happy and people like Jack Carter employed, and the fact that these two things had collided on his watch clearly pained him deeply. Jack, he said, clasping his hands on his desk, you understand I have no choice here. She called. Her attorney called. Gerald grimaced. At 7 this morning. She says you were insubordinate, that you endangered guest safety by bringing equipment into the event space, and that you recorded and distributed a private interaction without consent. I didn't record anything. The documentary crew did. I know. And I told them that. But she's threatening to pull a conference contract worth... Gerald stopped himself, rubbed his forehead. Jack, I'm sorry. I genuinely am. You've been a good employee, but I have to let you go. Jack sat with that for a moment. He'd known it was coming. He'd known it the moment he opened his mouth in that ballroom. Knew it the way you know a storm is coming, not because you can see it, but because the air changes. Okay, he said. Gerald blinked. Okay, okay. He stood up, offered his hand. I understand. Thank you for the 8 months, Gerald. Gerald shook it, looking like a man who had expected an argument and didn't know what to do with the absence of one. Is there anything you need? A reference, I'll write you the best reference. I'm fine. Jack picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. Take care of yourself. He walked out through the lobby past the portrait of Aria Vale and out into the gray October morning. He sat in his car for a while, not moving, just sitting. The thing about being invisible, he thought, was that invisibility was a choice, a strategy, and strategies could be changed. He pulled out his phone and looked at the video again. 4.3 million views now. His face was blurred. The documentary crew had apparently edited the release thoughtfully, but his voice was clear. His words were clear. He watched it twice. Then he scrolled past. It opened his email and found a message he'd been composing in his head for 3 weeks, ever since he'd first found the documents. He hadn't been looking for them. That was the thing he kept coming back to. He hadn't gone looking for anything. It was a Tuesday night, 6 weeks ago, maybe 7. He'd been working the executive floor, the 22nd floor, of the Whitmore Grand, where Vale Corporation kept a permanent suite during the gala planning period, a block of 5 rooms that their executives used for meetings and apparently for leaving an extraordinary amount of paperwork in recycling bins. He was supposed to empty the bins. That was it. That was the whole job. The folder had been sitting right on top of the pile in the conference room bin. Not shredded, not locked. Just sitting there, manila, with a tab that read Q, 3 consolidated financials, internal review only. Jack had almost dropped it straight into his cart. Almost. But something made him look. He still couldn't explain it exactly. Some reflex from the decade he'd spent as an accountant, some pattern recognition that fired before his brain consciously decided to engage. He flipped the folder open, expecting the usual corporate boilerplate. What he saw instead made his stomach drop. He'd read financial statements long enough to know what they were supposed to look like. Revenue flow liability columns, depreciation schedules. The language of money, which he'd spoken fluently for years. And what he was reading right now was not the language of a healthy company. It was the language of a company that had learned to lie in a very particular and very sophisticated way. The revenue numbers on the public-facing documents, the ones Vale Corp had filed with the SEC, the ones that had Forbes calling Aria Vale the most successful businesswoman of her generation, were not matching the internal figures. Not even close. The gap wasn't a rounding error. It wasn't an accounting adjustment. It was a canyon. He stood there in the empty conference room for a long time, the recycling cart forgotten beside him, reading. Then he put the folder back in the bin, finished his shift, and went home. He didn't sleep. Over the next 6 weeks, he came back to that floor every shift, and every shift there was more. Not always in the bins, sometimes on the tables, sometimes in the shredder tray, sometimes in the documents left behind by executives who treated the hotel like an extension of their own offices and treated hotel staff like they were part of the furniture. He photographed nothing. He took nothing. He read, memorized, and wrote it all down in a composition notebook he kept in his locker, filling it in during his breaks, building a picture that grew clearer and more alarming with every shift. The picture it showed was, this Vale Corporation was insolvent. Not struggling, not over-leveraged, insolvent. The company's publicly reported assets were inflated by a factor of 3. Its liabilities buried under a labyrinth of subsidiary companies and offshore accounts were enormous. Its pension obligations for nearly 12,000 employees were underfunded by hundreds of millions of dollars. And the board of directors, if they knew, and some of them had to know, had been allowing it to continue, while Aria Vale opened new divisions, cut deals with foreign investors, and stood on stages accepting awards for transformational leadership. The real question wasn't whether Vale Corp was going to collapse. The real question was when. And who would be left holding the bag? The answer, if the pattern held, was the 12,000 people who showed up every morning and did their jobs. The people whose retirement accounts were tied to a company that had already quietly spent their futures. Jack knew that feeling. He'd seen it happen before. Not at this scale, but close enough. He wasn't going to watch it happen again. Chapter. The email he'd been drafting was to a man named Robert Shen, his former law school classmate, who had gone on to become one of the most aggressive corporate acquisition attorneys in the Midwest, while Jack had gone the accounting route. They hadn't spoken in years. But Robert's number was still in his phone, and Robert picked up on the second ring when Jack called him that October morning after walking out of Gerald Fitch's office. "Jack Carter," Robert said. "I saw the video. I need to meet with you." A pause. "Is this about the video? Because I have to tell you, if you're looking for a wrongful termination suit." "It's not about the video." Another pause, longer this time. "Then what is it about?" Jack looked out through his windshield at the gray sky. "It's about Vail Corporation. I need you to help me buy it." The silence on the other end of the phone lasted so long that Jack thought the call had dropped. Then Robert Shen said very slowly, "Jack, what exactly have you been doing in that hotel?" "My job," Jack said, "and paying attention." He drove home, made coffee, called Mrs. Flores to let her know he'd pick Ella up from school. Ella was 11 and had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, which was a combination that kept Jack on his toes every single day, and also made him prouder than he'd ever admitted to anyone. She came out of school at 3:15 with her backpack half open and a permission slip crumpled in her fist. "Dad," she said, climbing into the car. "Why are you home early? Did something happen?" "I lost my job," he said. She looked at him, not with panic, with the particular calm of a kid who had learned early that calm was sometimes the most useful thing you could offer. "Are we going to be okay?" "Yeah, baby. We're going to be okay." She nodded slowly, like she was filing that away. Then, "Is it because of the video?" He glanced at her. "You saw it." "Dad, everyone saw it." She pulled at a thread on her backpack strap. "Kylie Peterson said that lady was really mean. I told her you probably said something smart back." "I said something." "What?" He told her. Ella was quiet for a moment. Then at a red light she looked up at him with her mother's eyes and said, "That's a good one, Dad." He laughed. It surprised him the way it came out real and full. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like that. "Yeah," he said. "I guess it was." They drove the rest of the way home in comfortable quiet. And in his chest, beneath the weight of the job and the worry and the long months of invisible labor, something was turning over. Something that had been waiting. He thought about the folder in the recycling bin, the composition notebook in his locker, which he needed to go retrieve now that he'd been let go. The 12,000 people at Vail Corp who came to work every morning thinking their company was solid. He thought about Robert Shen picking up on the second ring. He thought about the video. About 6 seconds that had changed the equation. Jack Carter had spent years making himself invisible. He was done with that now. The composition notebook was blue. Nothing special, the kind you could buy 3 for $1 at any drugstore in America. Jack had picked it up on a whim one evening, tucking it under his arm alongside a bottle of water and a pack of gum, never imagining it would become the most important object he owned. He got it out of his locker the morning after his termination, showing up at the Whitmore Grand's service entrance at 7 a.m., with his termination letter in his back pocket, and the particular calmness of a man who had already decided what came next. The overnight security guard, a heavy-set guy named Phil, who Jack had shared a thermos of coffee with on a dozen cold nights, buzzed him in without a word, and looked somewhere else while Jack cleaned out his locker. The notebook was at the bottom, under a spare pair of gloves and a granola bar he'd forgotten about. He held it for a moment. 47 pages front and back filled with his handwriting, the tight, careful notation of someone trained to reduce complex financial realities into clear language. Numbers, names, dates. The anatomy of a very large and very deliberate lie. He zipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, nodded to Phil on his way out, and drove to Robert Shen's office. Robert Shen operated out of a glass-fronted building downtown that looked modest from the outside and was anything but inside. The man himself was exactly as Jack remembered him, compact, precise, the kind of person who thought 3 moves ahead in every conversation and made it look effortless. He was already on his second coffee when Jack arrived and pushed the notebook across his desk without preamble. Robert opened it, read the first page, then the second. Then he stopped, looked up at Jack, looked back down at the notebook and read for 11 more minutes without saying a single word. Finally, he closed it. "Where did you get this?" "I wrote it." "I know you wrote it. Where did the information come from?" "Recycling bins," Jack said. "Conference tables. A shredder tray that was jammed for 3 weeks on the 22nd floor. Places where people put things when they think no one who matters is watching." Robert set the notebook down with the deliberate care of someone handling evidence, which was exactly what it was. "Jack, you understand that some of what you're describing, if it's accurate, represents one of the larger financial frauds in this city's corporate history." "I know what it represents." "And you want to buy the company?" "I want to buy the company, stabilize it, protect the employees, and restructure it from the ground up." "Yes." Robert leaned back in his chair and studied him for a long moment. "With what money?" Jack had been waiting for that question. He reached into his jacket pocket, not the notebook side, the other one, and pulled out a folded envelope, which he placed on the desk next to the notebook. Robert opened it. His eyebrows moved, which for Robert Shen was the equivalent of any other man's jaw-dropping. "Carter Holdings. I set it up 4 years ago. Kept it quiet. I had good reasons to stay off the radar for a while." Jack paused. "The accounting business didn't go completely under. I liquidated a lot, but I reinvested the rest. Carefully, quietly. The medical debt is gone. The firm's debts are paid. What's in that envelope is the current balance sheet and the shareholder structure. This says you have access to $42 million. Not all liquid, but enough for a controlling stake purchase, especially if Vale Corp's real asset value is as deflated as my notes suggest." He tapped the notebook. "Which it is." Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've been planning this." "Not this specifically. I was planning something. I just didn't know what yet." Jack looked at him steadily. "Now I do." Robert picked up the notebook again, turned to a page in the middle, and ran his finger down a column of figures. "These liability estimates, the pension underfunding. How confident are you in these numbers?" "Confident enough that I lost sleep over them for 6 weeks. If these are right, the board has exposure that—" Robert stopped himself, tapped the table once, made a decision. "Okay, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to need 3 days to verify what I can through public channels, SEC, filings, property records, the subsidiary structures. If your numbers hold up, and I think they will, because your numbers always held up, then we move." He pointed at the notebook. "I need to make copies of this." "Already made 2, Jack said. "One's in a safety deposit box. The other one," he paused, "is somewhere safe." Robert looked at him with something that wasn't quite a smile, but was close to one. "You're not the same guy who used to argue about deductibles over coffee in law school." "That guy's still in here. He's just been listening for a while. Listening and mopping floors." "You'd be surprised what you learn," Jack said, "when people think you're furniture." The 3 days Robert needed turned into 5. Jack spent them at home running Ella to school, doing laundry, cooking the kind of slow meals he only made when he had time, chili that went on the stove, at noon cornbread from scratch because Ella said the boxed kind tasted like cardboard. Normal life running on the surface, and underneath it, every quiet moment, the gears turning. He wasn't nervous exactly. He was alert. There was a difference. Nervous was uncontrolled, it spilled out and made things worse. Alert was focused. Alert was useful. On the 4th day, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. "Is this Jack Carter?" A woman's voice. Professional, but with an edge of something urgent underneath. "Who's asking?" "My name is Dana Mercer. I'm a financial journalist at the Tribune. I've been following the Vale Corporation story for 8 months. A pause. "I also saw the video." Jack moved to the kitchen window. Ella was outside on the front steps doing homework too close, in the way that kids always were when they didn't mean to be. He walked to the back of the house. What Vale Corporation story publicly? There isn't one. Not publicly. Not yet. Another pause, more deliberate. Mr. Carter, I think we may be looking at the same thing from different angles. I'm not here to print anything without your permission. I'm here because what I have, and what I suspect you have together, it's... She stopped. Can we meet? Jack thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. Not yet, he said. Give me your number. I'll call you when I'm ready. Mr. Carter, Ms. Mercer. He said it the same way he'd said Ms. Vale in that ballroom level and final, but without any heat in it. I'll call you. Thank you for reaching out. He hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment. Dana Mercer. He looked her up. 8 years at the Tribune, 2 regional journalism awards, a notable series 3 years back on municipal pension mismanagement that had won her fans and enemies in roughly equal measure. She was good. She was also, if she was calling him, getting close. Close enough that someone had either tipped her off or she'd found a thread of her own and pulled it. He texted Robert. Someone else is looking at Vale Corp. Tribune reporter Dana Mercer, 8 months in. Robert's response came back in under a minute. I know. I've known for 2 months. She's legitimate. Keep her at arm's length for now, but don't close the door. Jack stared at that message for a moment. Then he typed, You knew for 2 months, and you didn't mention her, Robert. You hadn't told me about the notebook for 2 months. We were both doing the same thing. Jack almost smiled. On the 5th day, Robert called. Sit down, he said, which was not how Robert Shen typically opened conversations. I'm already sitting. Good. A sound of papers. Your numbers are conservative, Jack. The pension underfunding isn't 300 million. It's closer to 450. The offshore subsidiary structure, I got someone I trust to dig into the Cayman layer, and there are transfers there that are going to require a very specific kind of attorney to untangle, and that attorney is going to have a field day. He paused. Vale Corporation's actual net value stripped of the inflated asset reporting is somewhere between -$40 and -$70 million. Oh, Jack absorbed that. It's already underwater. It's been underwater for at least 4 years. What you're seeing, the new divisions, the foreign partnerships, the award circuit. Aria's been running. All of it has been functioning as a delay mechanism. Keep the surface looking good. Keep investor confidence up. Keep the stock from cratering long enough to... Robert stopped. Long enough to do what? That's the question I can't fully answer yet. Long enough to get out, Jack said flatly. If you know it's going to collapse, you want to control when. You want to have your assets moved, your exposure minimized before it goes public. That's the darkest interpretation. Is there a lighter one? Robert was quiet for a moment. Not really, no. Another pause. Jack, do you know what happened to Edmund Vale's estate? Edmund Vale, Aria's father, the man who had founded Vale Corporation 30 years ago and built it into a legitimate powerhouse before handing the reins to his daughter and dying of a stroke 2 years later. Jack frowned. I assumed it passed to Aria. Some of it did. But a significant portion, and this is in public probate records anyone could find, it was structured into a family trust, a trust that Aria does not fully control. She has operational authority over the company, but the trust holds a 31% stake and is managed by a board of trustees. Robert let that sit for a second. 3 of those trustees have been trying to request a forensic audit of Vale Corp's books for 14 months. Aria has blocked it each time. Jack sat very still. She knows. She has to know. Whether she understood the full picture when she took over, or whether she discovered it gradually, I can't say. But she knows now. She's been managing it. Robert's voice was careful, which makes this more complicated and more urgent. Because if the trustees finally succeed in forcing that audit, the whole thing unravels before we can get in front of it. Exactly. How much time do we have? The trustees have a motion before a Delaware court that's set for hearing in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Jack stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window. Ella had come inside. He could hear her moving around upstairs, the particular rhythm of her footsteps that he could identify even through a ceiling. He thought about the 12,000 employees, about pension funds, about the people who came to work every morning and assumed that the company they'd built their lives around was real. "Then we move," he said. "What do we need?" "A letter of intent, a financing package, and about 4 days of all-nighters," Robert said. "I'll call my team. You call your financial guy, whoever's been managing Carter Holdings." "Already texting him." "And Jack." Robert's voice changed, went quieter. "This is going to get ugly before it gets better. You understand that. When it comes out the story, the acquisition, your identity, it's not going to be clean. There will be people who think you're a hero and people who think you engineered this whole thing as some kind of revenge play. Let them think what they want. It might affect Ella, reporters' attention. I'll handle that. I know you will." A pause. "For what it's worth, Jack. What you did in that ballroom, I don't think you planned it. But it set this in motion. You know that." Jack thought about the camera, about the 6 words that had turned into 4 million views, and then 6 million, and then he'd stopped checking. About the video playing on someone's phone somewhere right now on a lunch break in a waiting room on a bus. "Then, I hope your vision is spotless. I said it because it was true," he said. "That's all." "That's all," Robert repeated like he was turning the phrase over to look at its bottom. "Okay, I'll be in touch by morning." He hung up. Jack put the phone face down on the table. Then he went upstairs, knocked on Ella's door, 2 quick taps their signal, and opened it. She was sitting cross-legged on her bed with a textbook open, but she wasn't reading it. She was looking at her phone. When she heard him, she turned it over quick, not quick enough. "Ella." "I wasn't doing anything." "What were you looking at?" She hesitated. Then she turned the phone over and handed it to him. It was the video. Not the original 6-second clip, a longer cut apparently recorded by a guest on the other side of the room that captured more of the exchange, more of Arya's voice, more of the silence that followed his words. The caption on this version read, "This man deserves better." Also, the CEO's face when he walks away. The comment section was he scrolled past it quickly. A lot of people with a lot of opinions. "There are 7 million views now," Ella said quietly. "I've been watching it since this morning." "Why didn't you say anything?" She shrugged, the particular shrug of a kid who carries things carefully because she's watched her parent carry things carefully. "You were busy, and you looked like you were thinking." He sat down on the edge of her bed, handed the phone back. "Things are going to get more complicated for a little while," he said. "With the video and some business stuff. There might be a tension. People might try to talk to you about me." She looked at him steadily. "What kind of business stuff?" "The big kind." She processed that, nodded slowly. "Is it the right thing to do?" He thought about the question, about the pension funds, about Edmund Vale's estate and the trustees and the motion in Delaware and the 12,000 people. About the notebook in his jacket pocket and the $42 million in Carter Holdings and Robert Shen's voice saying this is going to get ugly. "Yeah," he said. "It's the right thing." "Then do it," she said simply, like it was obvious, like it was already settled. He looked at his daughter for a moment. This kid who had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness, and apparently a wisdom that belonged to neither of them. He felt something shift in his chest, something that had been pulled tight for months. "You eat dinner yet?" he asked. Mrs. Flores brought tamales. "Good woman, Mrs. Flores." "Dad, she's been talking to you for like 2 years. She talks to everyone. About you." Ella rolled her eyes with the full theatrical commitment only a preteen could achieve. "She basically described your entire personality to me last week in the order she finds them charming." I nearly died. Jack laughed again, that real surprised laugh. "Go to sleep at a reasonable hour." "Define reasonable." "Before midnight." "Extremely reasonable." "Done." He closed her door, stood in the hallway for a moment, one hand on the wall, the quiet house around him. Sarah's photo was on the table at the end of the hall. He passed it every night on the way to his room. He stopped in front of it now. He didn't talk to the photo. He never had been the kind of person who talked to photos. But he looked at it, took a breath. I'm doing something, he thought. Not sure if it was to her or to himself. Something real. The next 4 days were the most concentrated work Jack had done since the worst months of Sarah's illness, when he had been running the accounting firm, managing her care, keeping Ella's world from fracturing all at the same time. The details of the ValeCorp acquisition were staggering in their complexity. ValeCorp was a publicly traded company. Any purchase had to navigate SEC disclosure requirements, anti-fraud provisions, the Delaware court timeline, and the existing shareholder structure, including those 31% trustees. Robert worked with a team of 6. Jack worked beside them, reviewing every document with the attention of someone for whom these numbers weren't abstractions. He knew what they meant. He had always known what numbers meant. That was the thing about him that the uniform had hidden, not the intellect, but the specificity of the knowledge. Anyone could be smart. Not everyone could read a consolidated financial statement and feel in their gut where the bodies were buried. On the second day, he called Dana Mercer. I'm ready to meet, he said, but I set the terms. Name them, she said. She didn't hesitate. That told him something. Nothing prints until I tell you it can. You get exclusive access, everything, my full account, the documents, the whole story. But the timing is mine. That's a hard ask for a journalist. I know. Take it or leave it. A pause, shorter than he expected. What's your timeline? 3 weeks, give or take. Another pause. Okay. But I want to verify what you have before I agree to sit on it. Fair, he said. Bring your best source checker. I'll have everything ready. They met in a coffee shop on the east side a Tuesday morning during the lunch rush, when the noise would cover their conversation. Dana Mercer was in her early 40s, with the kind of direct gaze that made Jack think she had probably been underestimated quite a bit in her career and had quietly decided to use that. She had a recorder and a legal pad, and she didn't try to be casual about either. He laid out what he had. Not everything, not the notebook itself, not yet, but enough. The structure of the fraud, the pension exposure, the timeline, the subsidiary maze. She listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been. When he finished, she looked down at her legal pad for a moment. How did you get all of this as a... She stopped herself. As a janitor. I was going to say as someone outside the company. Same thing in this context. He held her gaze. People forget that invisible isn't the same as absent, Ms. Mercer. I was in those rooms every night. I heard every conversation that happened in the hallways. I read every document that went into those bins. He paused. Aria Vale looked at me and saw someone who wasn't worth worrying about. That was her mistake. Dana was quiet for a moment. Then she said very carefully, You're not doing this for revenge. It wasn't a question, but he answered it anyway. No. There are 12,000 people at ValeCorp who didn't do anything wrong. They came to work. They did their jobs. They trusted that the company was real. He let that sit for a second. I know what it feels like when that trust gets broken and the bill comes due. I'm not going to watch it happen to them. She looked at him for a long time. Then she clicked her pen. Okay, Mr. Carter, she said. Let's talk terms. Outside, the city moved around them, cabs and foot traffic and the ordinary noise of a Tuesday that didn't know yet what was coming. 3 weeks, give or take. The Delaware court, the board meeting. The moment when everything Jack had been carrying in that blue composition notebook would stop being private knowledge and become the most public thing in the room. He ordered a second coffee and got back to work. The letter of intent landed on Vale Corporation's registered legal address on a Wednesday morning, 17 days after Jack had walked out of Gerald Fitch's office, with a blue notebook in his jacket and a decision already made in his chest. It was a clean document. Robert Shen didn't do anything that wasn't clean, 12 pages formal, and precise, outlining Carter Holdings' intention to acquire a controlling stake in Vail Corporation through a structured purchase offer contingent on independent financial review. The offer price was calculated to be attractive enough that the board couldn't ignore it, and low enough to reflect what the company was actually worth. Robert called Jack the moment the courier confirmed delivery. "It's in," he said. "Clock starts now." "How long before they respond?" "Legally, they have 5 business days. Realistically," a pause. "I'd expect a call from their attorney by end of day. This is going to land like a grenade, Jack." It landed faster than that. By 2 in the afternoon, Robert's phone was ringing. By 3, Jack's was. The number was unlisted. He answered anyway. "Mr. Carter." A man's voice. Measured, expensive-sounding, the voice of an attorney who had been doing this long enough to make every word cost something. "My name is Harrison Wells. I represent Vail Corporation and its CEO, Aria Vail. I'm calling regarding the letter of intent your firm submitted this morning." "I figured," Jack said. "I'm going to be direct with you. This offer and the premise behind it is highly irregular. Carter Holdings is not a firm with any public profile in this sector, and the valuation your attorneys have proposed is a pause that was doing a lot of work significantly below anything our board would consider. Your board should probably read the offer before deciding what they'd consider." A brief silence. "Ms. Vail would like to meet with you personally. She feels that a direct conversation would be more productive than correspondence between legal teams." Jack leaned back in his chair. Ella's drawings were pinned to the wall above his desk, a habit she'd maintained since she was 5, papering his workspace with whatever she was working on like she was claiming territory. He looked at a drawing of a house with too many windows and a sun that took up a quarter of the sky. "Tell Ms. Vail I'm available Thursday at 10, he said. "She can come to my attorney's office. Robert Shen's firm downtown. He'll send the address." Another pause. Longer. She was expecting a more neutral location. "My attorney's office is neutral. It's also where all my documentation is, which will make the conversation more efficient." He let that sit for exactly 1 second. "Thursday at 10, Mr. Wells. Looking forward to it." He hung up and called Robert before the echo had settled. "She wants to meet. Thursday, your office." Robert was quiet for half a beat. "She's going to come in swinging. Her lawyer will have briefed her on Carter Holdings by tomorrow morning, whatever they can dig up, which isn't much, because you've kept it quiet. She's going to walk in thinking she has the upper hand." "Good," Jack said. "Let her think that." "Jack, she's not stupid. Reckless, maybe. Arrogant, definitely. But not stupid. Don't underestimate her." "I'm not underestimating her. I'm letting her underestimate me. There's a difference." Thursday came cold and gray. Jack arrived at Robert's office 40 minutes early, went through the documents one more time, and was standing at the window with a cup of coffee when the elevator opened at 10:03 and Aria Vail walked in. She was dressed differently than she had been at the gala. No midnight gown, no performance glamour. She was in a charcoal blazer, her hair pulled back, and she looked like someone who had not slept well in several days and was refusing to let it show. Harrison Wells walked half a step behind her, carrying a briefcase, and the expression of a man who had been up since 5 managing bad news. She saw Jack. He watched the recognition cross her face, the slight narrowing of the eyes, the almost imperceptible pause in her stride. She had known his name since yesterday, had presumably looked at every public record available on Carter Holdings and its principal. She had known she was walking into a room with the janitor from the video. But knowing it and seeing it were different things, and he could see her recalibrating in real time, the way a chess player recalculates when the board shifts unexpectedly. To her credit, she didn't flinch. "Mr. Carter," she said. Her voice was controlled, perfectly controlled. "I have to say, this is not a meeting I anticipated having." "No," he agreed. "I imagine not. Please sit down." Robert made the introductions to Harrison Wells and his own associate, and they all arranged themselves around the conference table. Robert and Jack on one side, Aria and Wells on the other, the documents spread between them like terrain. Aria set her hands flat on the table. "I'm going to skip the formalities," she said. "Your offer is insulting. Whatever your firm thinks Vale Corporation is worth, you're wrong by a factor of Ms. Vale. Jack's voice was quiet. Same tone as the ballroom. Same wall behind it. Before we talk about the offer price, I'd like to share some documents with you. He nodded to Robert, who slid a folder across the table. Arya looked at it, didn't open it. What is this? Consolidated financial analysis. Internal figures cross-referenced against your SEC filings for the past 4 fiscal years. He paused. You might want to look at page 7 first. She looked at Wells. Something passed between them, a communication too small and too fast for Jack to read with certainty. But he read it anyway. She knew. She already knew what was going to be on page 7. She opened the folder. The room was quiet. Harrison Wells leaned over and read alongside her. His expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened by a degree that someone less observant than Jack would have missed. Arya turned to page 7. She read it for a long time. Then she closed the folder and put her hands back on the table. "Where did you get this?" she asked. Her voice was still controlled, but something underneath it had changed, a frequency shift low and taut. "The same place I got all of it," Jack said. "From your building. From the papers your executives left behind when they thought no one was watching." He met her eyes directly. "I was watching Ms. Vale. Every night for 6 weeks, I was right there in those rooms, and I was watching." Something crossed her face then. Not anger, or not only anger. Something more complicated, something that looked for just a moment like fear. "You were the janitor," she said. It came out differently than it had in the ballroom. Not contempt. Something closer to realization. "I was the janitor," he said. Harrison Wells cleared his throat. "I need to advise my client before this conversation continues." Harrison. Arya said his name once flat, and he stopped. She hadn't taken her eyes off Jack. "How much do you know?" "Enough." He leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Vale, I want to be clear about something. I'm not here to destroy your company. I'm not here because of the video, or because of what happened at the gala. I'm here because there are 12,000 people who work for Vale Corporation, who have done nothing wrong and are sitting on top of a financial structure that is going to collapse and bury them when it goes." He paused. "My offer is not an attack. It's the only viable path I can see to getting in front of this before the Delaware court forces a forensic audit and the whole thing becomes a public freefall." The silence in the room was the kind that had weight. Arya was very still. Jack had expected anger, had prepared for. It had built the entire structure of this meeting around managing it. What he hadn't quite prepared for was what he was seeing instead, which was a woman who had been carrying something enormous for a very long time, suddenly feeling the full weight of it in her hands. "You know about Delaware," she said quietly. "I know about Delaware. I know about the trustees. I know about the motion." He kept his voice even. "I know the hearing is in 6 days. Harrison Wells started to speak again. "Mr. Carter, without admitting to any of the characterizations in your document." "Harrison." Arya again, firmer this time. She looked at Wells and he closed his mouth. Then she looked back at Jack. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Carter Holdings acquires a controlling 53% stake at the offered price. We inject capital sufficient to address the immediate pension liability. We bring in an independent board and initiate full restructuring under Chapter 11 if necessary, but with a management plan that preserves employment. We do this before the Delaware hearing, which gives us narrative control and a restructuring framework the court can work with instead of against." She stared at him. "And what happens to me? That's part of what we need to discuss." "I'm asking you directly." Jack looked at her directly back. "You step down as CEO. You cooperate fully with the restructuring, the independent audit, and whatever regulatory process follows. In exchange, the disclosure of your specific knowledge and involvement, the timeline, the decisions is handled through the legal process with full cooperation credit. Robert has contacts at the SEC. Cooperation matters." Arya Vale had built her entire adult life on the certainty that she was the smartest, most powerful person in any room she entered. Jack could see that certainty right now, not gone, but cracked hairline fractures running through it in all directions, the way ice looks in the moment before it breaks. "You're offering me a way out," she said. "I'm offering you the only way out that doesn't end with 12,000 people losing their pensions and you losing everything else." Harrison Wells leaned in and murmured something in her ear. She listened without looking at him. Then she said, "I need 48 hours. "You have 24, Jack said. "The Delaware hearing is in 6 days. We need time to file." She looked at him for a long moment. He didn't look away. "Fine," she said. 24 hours. She stood, gathered herself in the way she always did, that particular posture learned or inherited that put her chin a degree above level. But it was different now, and they both knew it. She picked up the folder, held it for a moment, then put it back on the table. "You know," she said, "when I had you fired, I thought it was a non-event. A loose end. The kind of thing that took 30 seconds and was done." She paused. "I owe you an apology for the gala." Jack let that land. Didn't rush to fill the space after it. "Yes," he said simply. "You do." She nodded once. Then she walked to the door, Wells behind her, and left. The elevator closed. Robert exhaled through his nose. That went better than it had any right to. "She's not beaten," Jack said. "Not yet. She's thinking." "What do you think she decides?" Jack looked at the folder she'd left behind. "I think she decides the same thing anyone decides when they realize the floor is actually a trapdoor. She takes the hand that's offered." He paused. "She just needs to believe it's real." The 24 hours passed in a way that felt longer and shorter at the same time. Jack cooked dinner, helped Ella with a science project about ecosystems that involved a depressing amount of poster board and glitter glue. Called his mother in Columbus, who had seen the video someone at her church had shown her, and alternated between being mortified and being proud in the way that only his mother could manage both simultaneously. "You should have just walked away from that woman, Jackie," she said. "Probably." He agreed. "But you didn't." "No." "That's your father in you," she said, which was the highest compliment she gave. His father had been a machinist for 31 years, a man who believed in showing up and keeping your word and doing the work in front of you, regardless of who was or wasn't watching. Jack thought about him every time he picked up a mop. At 9:47 the next morning, Harrison Wells called Robert and communicated in the precise language of men who are paid by the word that Aria Vale was prepared to enter into preliminary agreement discussions. Robert told Jack at 9:49. "She's in," he said. "Not all the way," Jack said. "Not yet, but moving." The next 4 days were the kind of work that didn't look like work from the outside. It was phone calls and document revision and a conference call at 7 in the morning with the Delaware court's clerk to file preliminary notification of an active acquisition and restructuring plan. It was a conversation with the 3 trustees that Robert brokered through an intermediary. 3 men who had been fighting for 14 months to get someone to look at the truth of Vale Corp's books, and who, when Robert explained who Carter Holdings was and what they had, went very quiet and then very eager. It was a call with the SEC's regional office that Robert handled, which Jack listened to from across the room, watching Robert's face do the careful, neutral thing it did when the conversation was going both better and worse than expected in different departments simultaneously. And underneath all of it, quiet and steady, was the countdown to the board meeting. Aria had agreed to one condition that had surprised Jack slightly. She asked to speak to the board herself before he was introduced. She wanted to be in that room when the truth came out, not delivered the news afterward. He had thought about it for half a day and agreed. Not because it was easy or strategically obvious, but because it was what he would have wanted. If the company he'd built had turned out to be something he hadn't understood, he would have wanted to be in the room. He would have wanted to face it. He gave her that. The board meeting was a Thursday. The Vale Corporation boardroom was on the 31st floor of the Vale Tower downtown. A glass and steel room with a table that could seat 20 and an arrangement of chairs that communicated without saying, so that some chairs were more important than others. Jack arrived with Robert and an associate named Priya, who had been doing corporate restructuring for 12 years and had the calm of someone who had seen everything and been surprised by very little. He wore a suit. Not the most expensive suit he owned. He wasn't interested in performance, but a good one. Dark gray, Sarah's favorite color on him. He'd stood in front of the mirror that morning for exactly as long as it took to make sure the tie was straight, and then he'd stopped looking. Ella had been at the top of the stairs when he came out. "You look like a dad who means business," she said. "That's the idea. Good luck." She said it the way she said most serious things, simple, direct, without decoration, like she trusted that luck was secondary to preparation, which she had learned from watching him. He carried her voice into the building with him up the elevator into the hallway outside the boardroom door. The board had been assembled under the pretext of an emergency shareholder session. 7 members around the table, 2 attending remotely by screen, Harrison Wells in the corner, and Arya at the head of the table. When Jack walked in behind Robert, several of the board members looked up with the expression of people encountering something they hadn't been told to expect. Arya saw him come in and didn't look away. Her hands were on the table the same way they'd been in Robert's conference room. She'd had 4 days since then. 4 days to decide what kind of person she was going to be in this room. She stood up. "Before we begin," she said, and her voice carried the voice that had always known how to fill a room, "I want to say something to this board." The members exchanged looks. "I've asked you here today for a session I told you was about shareholder reporting. That's not entirely accurate." She paused, looked down at the table for a moment, then back up. "What this meeting is actually about is the future of this company and the truth about its present, both of which you have a right to hear." She glanced at Jack, brief, purposeful. "And someone else should be doing most of the talking." She sat down. Robert touched Jack's arm lightly. Jack walked to the head of the table. The board was looking at him with varying configurations of confusion, suspicion, and the particular wariness of people who can feel the ground shifting and don't know yet in which direction. One of them, a heavy-set man named Garrett, who had been on the board for 11 years. Jack had read his bio, was already sitting back in his chair with his arms crossed, which was the body language of a man who had already decided this was an attack and was preparing his defense. Jack put his hand on the back of the chair at the head of the table and looked at all of them. He didn't sit. He didn't need to. "My name is Jack Carter," he said. "I'm the principal of Carter Holdings. 6 weeks ago, I was the night shift janitor cleaning this company's executive floors at the Whitmore Grand Hotel." He let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. "I'm telling you that not to be dramatic. I'm telling you because it's where I found all of this." He opened the folder in front of him. Priya stepped forward and began distributing copies around the table, clean-tabbed, organized by fiscal year. "What you're looking at is a reconciliation of Vail Corporation's public financial reporting against its internal records for the past 4 years. I'm going to walk you through it section by section, and I'm going to ask you to stay with me because what it shows is important, and it's not simple." He looked around the room. "But I think you're all capable of understanding it, and I think some of you already know what you're going to see." Garrett's arms were still crossed. 3 other members had already opened their folders. The 2 on screens were leaning forward, and Arya Vail at the far end of the table was looking at Jack Carter with an expression he hadn't expected and couldn't quite name. Not defeat, not relief, not anger. Something older and quieter than any of those. The expression maybe of someone who had been holding a door closed against enormous pressure for a very long time and had just finally stepped back and let it open. He began. He talked for 41 minutes. He had rehearsed it with Robert twice, once at midnight and once at 6 in the morning, and both times Robert had told him to slow down on the pension section because people's eyes glazed when the numbers got dense, and he needed them to feel it, not just follow it. So he slowed down. He used plain language, not because the board couldn't handle technical language, but because plain language didn't let anyone hide behind confusion. Plain language put everything on the table where everyone could see it. He walked them through the asset inflation year by year, showing exactly where the numbers diverged between the internal records and the SEC filings. He walked them through the subsidiary structure, the maze of offshore entities that had been used to park liabilities far enough from the main balance sheet that they wouldn't register in a standard audit. He walked them through the pension fund, and this was the part he slowed down the most, because this was the part that involved real people and real futures, and he wanted every person in that room to understand what underfunded by $450 million actually meant in human terms. It meant people who had worked for 30 years expecting a retirement that wasn't there. It meant people who had trusted the company with the most vulnerable part of their financial lives. It meant people who had done absolutely nothing wrong. By the time he reached the final section, the timeline of what Robert's team believed to be knowing misrepresentation to investors, the room was entirely different from the room it had been when he started. Garrett's arms were no longer crossed. He was leaning forward with his reading glasses on, moving through the tabbed sections with the focused intensity of a man who had just realized the building he was standing in was constructed differently than he thought. Two other board members were whispering to each other. One woman, a woman named Carol Marsh, who had joined the board 18 months ago, and who Jack had noted in his research had been quietly asking questions. For most of that time had her hand pressed flat against her folder like she was steadying herself. One of the remote attendees, a man named Phil Drucker, who had made his money in logistics and joined the Vail board 4 years ago, spoke first. His voice through the screen was slightly compressed, but his tone was clear. Ms. Vail. He wasn't looking at Jack anymore. He was looking at Arya. Were you aware of the pension liability figures as presented here? The room waited. Arya had her hands on the table. She had barely moved in 41 minutes. Yes, she said. The word came out clean. No qualification, no deflection. Just the single syllable with all of its weight. I became fully aware approximately 22 months ago. Some of what I'm seeing in Mr. Carter's presentation, I understood earlier than that in partial form. The full picture, the scope of it, I understood 22 months ago. The silence that followed was the kind that had texture. Carol Marsh spoke without looking up from her folder. And the SEC filings filed after that date. It wasn't a question. Arya answered it anyway. Were not corrected. No. Garrett pulled his glasses off, put them on the table, looked at Harrison Wells, who was sitting very still in the corner with the expression of a man who was doing complex mathematics in his head. Harrison, I need to understand our exposure. This is not the appropriate forum, Wells began. Harrison. Garrett's voice had the edge of a man who had just realized he had been a member of a board that was going to be the subject of a federal investigation and wanted answers immediately. Our exposure. Wells closed his eyes briefly. Significant. Varying by individual member, depending on what each member knew and when. Phil Drucker's voice came through the screen again. I want it on the record right now that I have been requesting independent financial review of this company for 14 months and have been denied each time. Noted, Robert said smoothly from his position to Jack's right. And documented, Mr. Drucker. Your requests are part of the record we've assembled. Jack let the room process for a moment. He had learned in those 10 years as an accountant that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do after laying out hard information was simply to stop talking and let people catch up to what they were feeling. The information had to travel from the head to the chest. That took a moment. He looked at Arya. She was looking at the folder in front of her, but he didn't think she was reading it. He thought she was somewhere else, some interior place that this moment had opened up. He thought about what Robert had said at the beginning of all this, about whether she had understood the full picture when she took over, or had discovered it gradually. He still didn't know the answer to that. He suspected the truth was more complicated than either option, that she had inherited something she didn't fully understand, had begun to understand. It had told herself it was manageable, had kept telling herself that while the gap between what she told the world and what was actually true kept widening until the lie was so large that correcting it felt more dangerous than continuing it. He understood the logic of that. He didn't excuse it, but he understood it. He said her name. She looked up. "I'd like to talk about what comes next," he said, "if the board is ready." Garrett looked around the table, a chairman's reflex checking the room. Nobody objected. He nodded at Jack. "Carter Holdings' proposal is structured in 3 phases," Jack said. "The first is immediate stabilization. We inject capital to address the pension liability not in full on day 1, but in a structured schedule that begins within 30 days and is legally binding. This protects employees first. That's non-negotiable." He paused and looked around the table. Nobody argued. "The second phase is restructuring. We file Chapter 11 with a management plan already in place, the plan Priya's team has been building for the past 2 weeks. The goal is not liquidation. The goal is emergence. We want this company to come out the other side intact, smaller, maybe more focused, but real. Actually real." He let that word land. The third phase is governance. New independent board, transparent reporting, full cooperation with SEC review. The restructuring period will be supervised, which means every financial decision gets scrutiny. That's not a punishment. That's how you rebuild trust. Carol Marsh spoke. What happens to current employees during restructuring? Protected under the management plan to the maximum extent the structure allows. Layoffs are a last resort, not a first tool. We're not coming in to strip this company. We're coming in to save it. He looked at her directly. That distinction matters to me personally. She held his gaze for a moment. "Why?" she asked, not challenging, genuine. "Because I've been one of those employees," he said. "And I know what it feels like when the people at the top make decisions and the people at the bottom pay for them." Phil Drucker from the screen. "Mr. Carter, what do you need from this board today? A vote of preliminary approval on the acquisition framework and authorization to file the restructuring plan with Delaware. Robert's team has the documents ready. If we vote today, we file tomorrow morning, which puts us ahead of the court hearing by 3 days and gives us control of the narrative instead of the other way around." Garrett put his glasses back on, looked at the folder, looked at Arya. "Arya, do you have anything to say to this board before we vote?" The room turned to her. Arya Vale looked up. She looked older than she had at the gala. Not worse, just more present. Like something performed had been set down, and what was left was just the person underneath it. She looked at each member of the board in turn slowly, and when she spoke, her voice didn't have its usual architecture of certainty. It was quieter, denser. "I owe each of you an apology," she said. "And I owe the people who work for this company a great deal more than that." She paused. "My father built something real. I inherited it, and I didn't protect it. I told myself I was managing a difficult situation, that I was keeping it together for everyone's sake. But the truth is, I was protecting myself. The fear of what admitting the truth would cost that fear made me dishonest in ways I can't fully justify." She looked down for a moment. "I know that's not enough. I'm not asking for forgiveness today. I'm asking for the chance to be part of fixing it." She looked at Jack. "Mr. Carter's plan is the right one. I'm recommending this board vote yes." Garrett looked around the table one more time. All in favor. 6 hands went up. Phil Drucker said aye through the screen. Carol Marsh raised hers last deliberate, like she was making sure it meant something. It was 7-0. Robert was already on his phone before the hands came back down. Afterward, when the board members were filing out in clusters of urgent conversation, Jack was packing up his folder when he heard Arya's voice behind him. "Mr. Carter." He turned. She was standing a few feet away, her own folder held against her chest. Harrison Wells not there for the first time since he'd known her. Just her. She looked at him the way she'd looked in Robert's conference room, but more of it now, more exposed without the controlled surface holding everything in place. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want an honest answer. I'll do my best. Did you plan this? From the beginning?" She held his gaze. Was this revenge for what happened at the gala for the firing? Was this the plan? He took a moment with it. Not because he needed it, but because she deserved the full weight of an honest answer, not a quick one. No, he said. I had the notebook before the gala. I'd been building the picture for weeks before that night. What happened in the ballroom, that wasn't strategy. That was just me not being able to stay quiet in a moment when staying quiet felt wrong. He paused. If you hadn't fired me, I probably would have found another way to get this in front of the right people. Maybe slower. Maybe without the video. But the goal would have been the same. She absorbed that. The 12,000 people. The 12,000 people. She nodded slowly. Then she said, my father, when he was building this company, he used to say that the real measure of a business was what happened to the people at the bottom when things went wrong. Whether the people with the most power used it to protect themselves or to protect everyone else. Her voice was quiet. I used to think he was being sentimental. He wasn't being sentimental. No, she said, he wasn't. She looked at the folder in his hand. What happens to me now practically, day to day? You cooperate with the process. Full transparency, every document, every account. Robert's contacts at the SEC will be in touch. The cooperation credit is real. It matters. It genuinely matters what you do from here. He met her eyes. I'm recommending you to the restructuring team as an operational consultant. Your institutional knowledge of this company is real, and it's valuable, and throwing it away doesn't help anyone. She blinked. You want me to stay involved? In a defined, supervised role. Not as CEO, not as decision maker. As someone who knows where everything is and can help rebuild it honestly. He paused. Only if you want to. There's no obligation. She was quiet for a long moment. Why would you do that? Because the point of this isn't your destruction, he said. It never was. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said something he hadn't expected, quiet and unguarded. I don't know if I know how to do things that way. The transparent way. The honest way. I grew up in a company where the surface was everything, where showing strength meant never admitting uncertainty. I don't know if I know how to do it differently. Neither did I when I started over, Jack said. You figure it out, one decision at a time. She nodded. Said nothing more. Walked to the elevator and was gone. Robert appeared at his shoulder. Ready? Yeah. Jack picked up the folder. File it in the morning. Already drafted. Priya's reviewing. We're done by 9. Robert glanced toward the elevator. She's going to have a very hard year. I know. You feel bad for her. Jack thought about it honestly. Some? Not all. He looked at the table where the folders were still scattered, the evidence of what had been said in this room today, spread across the mahogany. She made choices. They weren't good choices. But she's choosing differently now. He turned toward the door. That has to count for something. He called Ella from the car. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been waiting. How did it go? Good, he said. It went well. Did they vote yes? 7-0. A sound on the other end that might have been her fist hitting her mattress. Yes, okay, good. A pause. Did she apologize, the CEO lady? In front of the whole board. Good. Ella's voice was serious the way it got when she was processing something important. Dad, she must have been really scared. Jack thought about Arya's face when she'd said, I don't know if I know how to do things that way. Yeah, he said. She was. It's scary to say you were wrong. It is. But it's the right thing. Yeah, baby, it is. A beat. Then, Mrs. Flores made pozole. Do you want me to save you some, or do you want me to eat it all because I will? I'm absolutely capable of that. He laughed. Save me some. No promises. He drove home through the early evening, the city doing what cities did, moving indifferent, loud and quiet at the same time. He thought about his father, about the machinist who showed up and did the work, regardless of who was watching. He thought about Sarah and her eyes and Ella, and the way grief and love were so tangled up in each other, they'd stopped feeling like different things. He thought about a recycling bin on the 22nd floor and a blue composition notebook, and a moment in a ballroom when he'd said something true to a camera he hadn't been looking for. The story was about to become public. Dana Mercer had her exclusive time to break 48 hours after the Delaware filing. The headline she'd drafted, she'd shared it with him as a courtesy, not an obligation, was 7 words: the janitor who bought the company clean. He'd told her she could do whatever she thought was right with it. She'd told him that was the most useful thing a source had ever said to her. He thought about what public would mean. The second wave of attention, bigger than the video, longer lasting. People would want to talk to him, write about him, make him into a symbol of something. He'd have to be careful about that, about what he let himself become in the telling. He wasn't a symbol. He was a man who had paid attention, done the math, and decided that walking away wasn't something he could live with. He parked in the driveway, sat for a moment. One thing at a time, he thought. File with Delaware. Let Dana run her story. Get through the first 30 days of restructuring. Protect the pension. Protect the jobs. Do the next thing in front of you. His phone buzzed. A text from Robert. SEC called. They want a meeting next week. Cooperative posture confirmed. This is going to move fast. He texted back. Ready. Another buzz. This one from a number he didn't recognize. He almost ignored it, then opened it. This is Aria. I wanted you to have my direct number for the restructuring process. I'll be in touch Monday. A pause. He could see the 3 dots indicating she was still typing. Then, for what it's worth. What you said in the boardroom about the employees. My father would have said the same thing. I'm sorry it took me this long to remember that. He read it twice, put the phone in his pocket, got out of the car, walked up the front steps. Through the door, the smell of pozole hit him, and he realized he hadn't eaten since early morning and was deeply, suddenly hungry. Ella was at the kitchen table with her homework, but she looked up the second he came in. She looked at his face the way she always did, reading it in the particular way she'd developed over years of calibrating to him, understanding his moods, the way you learned the weather of a place you'd lived your whole life. You okay? She asked. Yeah. He hung up his jacket. Yeah, I'm good. You look like you're thinking hard. I'm thinking about dinner. He went to the stove, lifted the lid on the pot Mrs. Flores had left. Steam came up warm and good. How was school? Boring except for science. We're doing ecosystems still. Ms. Rivera says I should consider environmental science. What do you think? I think she's not wrong, but I also think I have time. She turned back to her homework. Then, without looking up, Dad, I'm proud of you. He stopped with the ladle in his hand. She was still looking at her homework the way she said important things, sometimes sideways at an angle, like she was letting him receive it without having to look directly at it. He set the ladle down. Come here. She came. He hugged her, the kind of hug that was too long to be casual, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said anything about it. I love you, kid, he said. I know, she said into his shoulder. The pozole smells really good. Yeah, it does. She pulled back, went back to the table. He filled a bowl and sat across from her, and they ate dinner together in the ordinary quiet of a house that had known hard years and had come through them, and outside the evening settled into night. And somewhere across the city, Dana Mercer was writing a story. And somewhere in the Vale Tower, a board was having conversations that would run until midnight. And in 3 days, the world would know everything. But right now, there was just this kitchen and this bowl and his daughter's pen moving across her homework. And Jack Carter was, for the first time in a long time, exactly where he was supposed to be. Dana Mercer's story ran on a Tuesday morning, 49 hours after the Delaware filing, just as Jack was dropping Ella at school. He found out the way most people found out: his phone started ringing and didn't stop. Robert first, then his mother, then a number from New York he didn't recognize, then 6 more he didn't recognize after that. He sat in his car in the school drop-off line for 10 minutes after Ella got out watching the notification count climb, and then he put the phone face down on the passenger seat and drove to Robert's office because that was the next thing in front of him, and he had decided to keep doing the next thing in front of him. The headline Dana had used in the end was not the 7 words she'd drafted. The final version read, "From mop to chairman. How a night shift janitor uncovered a $500 million fraud and saved 12,000 jobs." It ran above a photograph, not of Jack, he'd declined photographs, but of the blue composition notebook open to a page of his handwriting sitting on Robert's conference table. Dana had asked permission for that specifically, and he'd said yes because he thought it told the true story better than his face would. It was just a notebook, ordinary, the kind anyone could buy. The piece itself was 4,200 words. Jack had read it the night before it ran at Dana's request for factual accuracy only. He'd corrected 2 dates and 1 figure and told her she'd done a good job. She'd said, "I know, this is the best thing I've written in 10 years. He'd said, "Then I'm glad you called me." And he meant it. By noon that Tuesday, the story had been picked up by the AP Wire. By 3, it was on cable news. By evening, it was everywhere. The kind of everywhere that the internet created, occasionally the sudden consensus of millions of people deciding simultaneously that a story mattered. The video clip from the gala ran alongside the Tribune piece in most of the coverage, those 6 seconds that had started all of this playing on loops on screens across the country. Then I hope your vision is spotless. Jack watched some of it from Robert's office, on a small television in the corner that nobody usually turned on. He watched a news anchor describe what Carter Holdings had done. He watched a financial analyst explain with charts what the pension underfunding had meant and what the restructuring plan was designed to do. He watched a brief clip of Aria Vale's attorney reading a prepared statement on the steps of the Vale Tower, confirming her resignation as CEO and her cooperation with the ongoing regulatory process, her face not on camera, just the words. He felt something watching that, not triumph. He'd been watching for triumph and he didn't find it. What he found was something quieter, a kind of solemnity, the feeling you got at the end of something long and hard, when the adrenaline released and left just the weight of what had actually happened. Real things had happened. Real people were going to be affected in real ways for better and for worse. And the fact that it was moving in the right direction didn't make it light. Robert came to stand beside him. "You know what I keep thinking about," he said. "What? The recycling bin." Robert shook his head slightly. "They just left it there. In the bin. Not shredded, not locked. Just in the bin." "People stop seeing the furniture," Jack said. "After a while, it doesn't occur to them to be careful around it. That's going to be in every business school case study about this company for the next 30 years. "Good," Jack said. "Let it be." The next 6 weeks were the hardest work of Jack's professional life, and he had chosen to call them the restructuring period, which was a technical term that didn't begin to capture what it actually was. What it actually was the daily effort of trying to hold a damaged thing steady while rebuilding the structure underneath it, which required patience and precision, and the willingness to make decisions that were right for the long term, even when they were painful in the short term. He became chairman. The title had been part of the acquisition agreement, and he wore it the same way he wore the suit, not as performance, but as function. His office was on the 22nd floor of the Vale Tower, which was not lost on him, though he didn't mention it to anyone. He kept his desk clear. He kept regular hours. He was available to employees at every level of the company, in a way that made his assistant, a capable woman named Judith, who had worked for 3 previous executives, and was openly suspicious of him for the first 2 weeks gradually, and then completely change her opinion of him. "You actually answer email," she said to him 6 days in with a kind of wonder that told him more about his predecessors than any document had. "I actually answer email," he confirmed. Mr. Vale never answered email. "I'm not Mr. Vale." "No," she said, and went back to her desk. And after that, she was unwaveringly in his corner in the particular way that competent assistants were when they decided to trust someone, protective, efficient, and occasionally terrifying, to anyone who tried to get in his way. The restructuring team worked in building blocks. First, the pension. The immediate infusion from Carter Holdings hit the pension fund in the promised 30-day window, which meant that on the morning the wire transfer cleared, 12,000 employees got a communication from the new management confirming that their retirement accounts were funded and protected. Jack insisted on writing that communication himself, which Priya's team had thought was unusual, and Robert had understood immediately. He kept it short. He told them the truth about what had happened in plain language. He told them what was being done. He told them their jobs were not at risk during restructuring unless the restructuring process required otherwise, and that if it ever did, they would be the first to know, not the last. The response from employees was something he hadn't prepared for. He'd prepared for relief, maybe for anger, some anger about what had been hidden from them, which was legitimate, and which he had no intention of managing away. What he hadn't prepared for was the number of people who wrote back, not to the general email address, but to him specifically, finding his address somehow, or going through Judith, or leaving handwritten notes at the front desk addressed to the chairman, people who worked in Vail Corp's distribution centers in Ohio and Kentucky. People in the legal department who had suspected something for years and hadn't known what to do with their suspicion. A maintenance worker from the building's facilities team who wrote 2 sentences, "I've been here 18 years. Thank you for being honest with us." Jack read that one 3 times. He pinned it to the wall above his desk, next to Ella's drawings. Aria came in on the second Monday of the restructuring period. She'd asked for a meeting through official channels, which Jack thought said something about where she was trying to go. He met her in the small conference room on 20. Not his office neutral ground, the same instinct she'd had about Robert's space, which he understood now better than he had then. She looked different. Not diminished, that wasn't the right word. Stripped, maybe. Like something had been removed that had been structural for so long that its absence was still surprising to her. She sat down across from him without the folder, without Wells, without any of the apparatus of her former authority. Just her. "The SEC meeting went 3 hours, she said. "Robert told me. He said you were thorough. I gave them everything." She looked at the table for a moment. "There were things I told them that I hadn't told anyone. Not even Harrison." She paused. It's a strange feeling, saying the true version out loud after carrying the other version for so long. "I imagine it is." "It feels lighter," she said, "which is not what I expected." She looked up. "I thought it would feel like losing everything. And it does in some ways. But underneath that..." She stopped, tried again. "Lighter." Jack nodded. He understood the word. Not from the same experience, but from the same direction. The lightness that came when the thing you'd been managing in private finally became something you were handling in the open. "The consulting role," she said. "Is that still on the table?" "Still on the table. I want to do it." She met his eyes. "Not to stay connected to the company out of attachment or ego. I know how it might look, but I know where everything is buried. The subsidiary documentation alone is going to take months to untangle, and I can cut that time in half because I know the structure." She paused. "I want to be useful, for the right reasons this time." "I know," he said. And he did know he'd watched her long enough to read the difference. "You'll work with Priya's team. Defined scope, full transparency, everything documented. You understand the oversight." "I more than understand it," she said dry. "I'm grateful for it." He almost smiled. "One more thing," he said. "The new board is going to want to speak with you directly, not just the legal team, you." She went slightly still. "Why?" "Because they need to know who you are now, not who you were. The restructuring plan depends on institutional knowledge and on the board trusting the people who have it." He looked at her steadily. "You sat in front of that board and said the true thing. That matters. Don't bury it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something he hadn't expected, something small and specific, and therefore more honest than anything large could have been. "My father sat in the chairman's chair at this company for 27 years, she said. "He sat in your chair." "I know. I think he would..." She stopped, steadied herself. I think he would have liked what you're doing with it. Jack sat with that, felt the weight of it and the gift of it. Thank you, he said. She nodded, stood, shook his hand formal, real, and left. He sat alone in the small conference room for a few minutes after she was gone. The building hummed around him, the ordinary sounds of 12,000 people's work, continuing phones. Elevators, the muffled rhythm of a company that was still standing because the floor had been caught before it gave way. He thought about Edmund Vail, building this company 30 years ago with something real, something that had mattered. He thought about how things eroded, not always dramatically, not always through malice, but sometimes just through the accumulated weight of fear and convenience, and the lie you told yourself that became the lie you told everyone else. He thought about the distance between what a thing was supposed to be and what it had become, and about the work of closing that distance. That was the work. Not glamorous, not a single moment of triumph you could freeze and put on a wall. Just the daily patient, sometimes grinding effort of making something real again. He went back to his office. 6 months after the board meeting on a Thursday morning in April, the company announced its new name. Carter Vail Group. The combined name had been the independent board's recommendation, a preservation of both histories, the acknowledgement that what they were building was neither a demolition nor a fresh start, but a reconstruction. Jack had thought about it for 2 days before agreeing. It felt right. Not comfortable right, which was different. The new name came with a new statement of purpose, which the communications team had drafted, and Jack had rewritten once in the way he rewrote things, not heavily, just tightening, removing the words that were there to sound good, rather than mean something. The final version read, Carter Vail Group exists to create real value for the people who work here, the communities we operate in, and the partners who trust us. Everything we do will be documented, explained, and defended in the open. We don't have anything to hide. We intend to keep it that way. Dana Mercer ran a follow-up piece on the 6-month anniversary. Jack agreed to be photographed this time, not in the office, not in the suit. She asked him where he wanted to do it, and he said the school where Ella went, because he was there every morning at drop-off and every afternoon at pickup. And that wasn't going to change because of a chairman's title. So the photograph that ran in the Tribune's business section on that Thursday was Jack Carter, in a jacket and jeans, standing on the sidewalk in front of Ella's school, one hand in his pocket, looking directly at the camera with the expression that Robert later said made him look like a man who had decided something and was at peace with having decided it. Ella had seen the final photo and said he looked like himself, which he took as the highest possible compliment. In the interview, Dana asked him the question that everyone had been asking in various forms for 6 months. What do you think the real lesson is of all of it? He thought about it the way he'd thought about Ella's question in the car, taking his time, giving it the full weight of honesty. I think the lesson is that power doesn't disappear when it's ignored, he said. It just moves. The question is always who's holding it and what they're doing with it. He paused. The janitor in the room isn't powerless. He's just not performing power. There's a difference. And sometimes the person who isn't performing it is the only one actually thinking straight. Dana smiled, wrote it down. Can I quote you on that? It's the truest thing I know how to say, he said. So yeah. The morning the article ran, Jack got to school drop-off at the usual time. Ella got out of the car with her backpack half open, the way it always was, and then she turned back. Dad. She said it through the open window. What? There are like 4 people on the sidewalk with cameras. He looked. There were, in fact, 4 people on the sidewalk with cameras. Word traveled fast. I see that. Is that going to happen a lot now? For a little while, probably. Is that okay? She considered this with the gravity of an 11-year-old who had thought about most things more seriously than the adults around her expected. As long as it doesn't make you weird, she said. Define weird. Like too important to eat dinner with me. That will never happen. Good. She hitched her backpack up. See you at 3. He watched her go through the school doors, gone from sight, carrying herself with the particular straightness she'd had since she was 4 years old, like she'd decided early that the world was going to have to deal with her, and had adjusted her posture accordingly. Sarah's eyes, his stubbornness, and something entirely her own. He drove to the office, took the elevator to 22, said good morning to Judith, who handed him a coffee and a summary of the morning's agenda without breaking stride, because that was how she operated, and he had come to find it deeply comforting. He sat down at his desk. The maintenance worker's note was still pinned above it. Ella's drawings flanked it on both sides. He looked at all of it for a moment before opening his laptop. His standard practice, the 60-second ritual of remembering what the work was actually for. His phone buzzed. Robert. SEC preliminary findings released this morning. Cooperation credit fully acknowledged. Aria's counsel says the personal exposure is significantly reduced. As expected. Jack texted back, "Good. Send her a note if you talk to her today." Robert already did. She said thank you. He set the phone down and opened the first document of the day. A revised pension schedule from Priya's team updated to reflect the second quarter capital injection. He read it line by line, the way he read everything carefully, with the full attention of someone who knew that the numbers were never just numbers, that behind every figure, there was a person who went to work in the morning and trusted that what they were working toward was real. The building hummed. The city moved outside the windows. 12,000 people were at their desks in their warehouses, on their trucks in their stores, doing the ordinary work of their ordinary days, not knowing, most of them, the specific shape of what had been done to keep that ordinary possible. And that was fine. That was how it was supposed to be. The work didn't need to be dramatic to be significant. It just needed to be done, and done honestly, and kept honest by the people with the power to protect it. That was the job now. Not the title, not the office, not the photograph in the Tribune. The job was this. Every document, every decision, every number looked at, directly called what it was, and accounted for openly. Every person who showed up to work at Carter Vale Group protected by the simple and radical practice of telling the truth. Jack Carter had spent years making himself invisible. He had spent years learning what rooms sounded like when people thought no one who mattered was listening. He had mopped floors and read recycling bins and filled 47 pages front and back in a blue composition notebook. And he had walked out of a ballroom with a mop bucket and 7 words and a camera he hadn't been looking for. He had done all of it with the same hands, the same steady attention, the same refusal when it came to the final moment to look away from what was in front of him. He turned to the first page of the pension schedule, read the first line, made a note in the margin, got to work. Because that was what real looked like. Not the headline, not the photograph, not the moment the board voted, or the moment the company got its new name. Real looked like this: a man at a desk on a Thursday morning doing the next right thing for the 12,000 people who deserved to have someone do it. Real looked like showing up. Real looked like paying attention when no one thought you were watching. Real looked like the work in front of you, done without shortcuts, done in the open, done for the right reasons. Jack Carter had always known that. He had just finally found the room where he could prove it.